This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to the November series of 1 month to a more effective compliance program series that I'm running in 2017. This month, we're going to take a look at 1 month of 360 degrees of communication in compliance. This month's sponsor is Dun & Bradstreet. The only thing that is constant right now in the regulatory environment is change. Supply chain leaders and compliance professionals alike continue to struggle with how to best adequately identify, screen, and gain visibility into ownership structures of third parties and or customers so that they understand exactly who they are doing business with. Companies can knowingly finance goods that are potentially obtained illegally or sold on the black market. Procurement teams that are unaware of third-party activities and have antiquated systems, they put their company at risk. Without proper visibility, these teams could unknowingly be funding terrorism or even engaging in human trafficking. In-depth research is needed to identify ultimate beneficial owners and third-party risks. No business ties to corrupt practices such as human trafficking or money laundering is going to self-report, so companies must take this work on themselves and obtain third-party data needed to determine risk, mitigate exposure, and protect their brand and comply with regulations. Dun & Bradstreet offers an end-to-end comprehensive solution to help organizations tackle this exact complexity. Leverage Dun & Bradstreet's complete due diligence reporting to know your vendor and your third-party partners. Do not expose yourself to undue risk. Contact Dun & Bradstreet today to learn more about vendor onboarding, supply risk management, and comprehensive compliance check. This month I'm going to tackle the concept of 360 degrees of communication and compliance. We're going to take a look at it from a variety of ways and mechanisms. We're going to consider the Chief Compliance Officer and his or her role in communications. We're going to take a look at how you can facilitate a two-way conversation of communications while sitting in the CCO suite. We're going to consider some of the leadership and other components of a CCO's role and how they will help you have a more robust and indeed holistic approach to compliance. We're going to consider the bottom-up approach to communications by utilizing communications techniques for your employees, third parties, contractors, and those that may come into contractual relationship with your company through the supply chain. We're going to consider 360 degrees of communications through operationalization of compliance and culture. It's going to be a very interesting month. I think as a CCO you will learn quite a bit, and at the end of the month you will not only have information which will allow you to be a more well-rounded CCO, but bring a much more holistic approach to your compliance function. My year-long series of 1 month to a more effective compliance program and the November edition of 1 month of 360 degrees of communication and compliance are a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. Day 20, what have we learned? This month has been a fascinating exploration of communication and compliance. I entitled it 360 degrees of communication and compliance because it has occurred to me that you have the opportunity to have an ongoing discussion about compliance at all times in your organization. Previously, I had thought of communications really as a two-way street, upward and downward, inbound and outbound, side to side, however you might choose to phrase it. But a 360-degree approach is something different. I don't think you communicate in just two ways now. I think you communicate in multiple ways. If you're just thinking about communications in the classic form, you're actually missing something that's happening around you. So 360 degrees of communication and compliance is not just a classic form of communication, but rather it's a communication in the concept of every interaction, whether they be planned interactions or whether they be accidental interactions. It's all a form of communication. This is particularly true if you're a compliance professional, a chief compliance officer, or a compliance practitioner. The things you do, the way people see you, you are always communicating. And it's not just communicating to one another. Often you're communicating to a group across group boundaries, to the constituencies you had not even planned to initially communicate with. So a 360-degree approach takes a much more holistic approach as opposed to just a you and me, up and down, inbound and outbound, side-to-side communication. Over this month, we've explored multiple forms of 360 degrees of communication. We've looked at social media. We've looked at the concept of sharing. We've considered the clash of cultures and how communication, a 360-degree approach to communication, can help overcome that. We've explored storytelling in compliance and teaching lawyers how to communicate in compliance. We've talked about persuasion, we've talked about self-reliance, and then multiplying the influence of compliance. While these may be thought of as leadership techniques, I've explored them in the concept or in the mechanism of 360 degrees of communication. We've also looked at communicating across cultural boundaries, how you can use social media tools such as Twitter, even things that you might not consider a communication tool, such as the supply chain, and how innovation in your supply chain around communication can be used for your organization. You probably had not considered crowdsourcing as a form of 360 degrees of communication. So it's been a fascinating exploration, and some of the things that I think you may not have considered as communication are things like utilizing communication to see around hard walls, that because of a 360-degree approach, you can certainly get or obtain more information. Also, communication can not only enhance your training, but actually expand your training. If you think of all forms of communication as training, you pretty quickly begin to see that your interactions with your employees are not only a form of training, but they're really a form of ongoing communications. And if you take the 360-degree approach, you're continually communicating about your culture. You're continually communicating about your values, and you're modeling for your employees the behaviors you want to see. So think about expanding your training repertoire by making it not training, but a 360-degree approach. Also consider that the Department of Justice takes a look at your training, but more importantly, they take a look at your compliance communications. Never forget the Morgan Stanley 2012 declination, where they specifically pointed out 35 compliance reminders emailed to a recalcitrant employee over 7 years. Well, what if your communications is a 360-degree approach, which allows you to document a continual form of communication and a continual stream of communication to your employee base? If the government ever comes knocking, you've got that record. Every time you've utilized a social media technique within behind your firewall, or any other form of communication, whether that be video, audio, email, written, or other. It's a very powerful way for you not only to get your message across, but also for you to protect yourself and protect your organization. And when you can utilize a tool or technique which not only helps you get your message out, but also helps you to further protect the company, that's a tool that I think is of high value to you. I'd like to end this month with a story that was told to me by Louis Sapperman. Louis is, of course, the Chief Compliance Officer at Dun & Bradstreet, and it happened to him in Argentina. Argentina has an interesting form of illegal conduct. It's a fairly open black market for the changing of currency. One time he was walking down the street and he needed to purchase something, a small amount. I think it was an ice cream cone, as he described it. And they asked if he wanted his change in for his dollars, because he only had U.S. dollars, in Argentinian pesos, and they would change them at a much higher rate than the government rate. So Lewis was only down there for 2 or 3 days, and he went into a convenience store with one of the leaders from the company's South American operations. And the person who was going to sell him the product suggested that he go just around the corner and change money on the black market where he could get a much better rate. It was almost 100% difference in the rate. He declined to do so. And he paid and received the established bank rate. And he really hadn't considered role modeling that compliance behavior, or that event as modeling compliance behavior. And about 6 months later, one of his team members was in Mexico speaking to the leader of the Dun & Bradstreet operation there. And he was the person who recounted this story of doing the right thing when literally no one was watching. The power of that communication really lives within Dun & Bradstreet. And it's given Louis Sapperman not only credibility, but it's given him a way to tell a story by acting the cultural values of the company. I hope you've enjoyed my deep dive exploration into 1 month to 360 degrees of communication and compliance. I hope you will join me next month when I begin on December 1 a new monthly series of 30 Days to a Better Compliance program. Next month, we'll be taking a look at the written standards needed for a best practices compliance program. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of 1 month to 360 days of communication and compliance. If you have listened to this podcast on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate our podcast, as it would help in our rankings and also help get the word out about the only daily compliance podcast involving the nuts and bolts of compliance. Also, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. Finally, I'd like to thank our sponsor for this month, Dun & Bradstreet. I hope you will join me tomorrow for another episode. The podcast series in November, 1 month to 360 degrees of communication, is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.